In this episode of Pedagogy After Dark, I explain why instructional design makes a difference. As I work as a consultant, a lot of times I go to new schools and teachers are somewhat reluctant to take my advice. I think maybe there's a belief about consultants that we're all talk and no experience. So what I've started to do is to give new teachers that I work with a copy of one of my units. And a lot of times I think they probably only teach it because it's something to do. They pick it up one day while I'm gone and they teach it. And by the time I come back, they're a lot more open to my advice. They want to know why the unit worked, why their students paid attention, why they were able to get their students to think this way. And what I tell them is that it's all about the instructional design. Now, when it comes to instructional design, I'm going to use one of those buzzwords in education that I'm always talking about. I'm sorry. But the biggest difference in the lessons is really that I practice backwards planning. And I know that's something that you're probably tired of hearing because it almost always means that we begin with the test in mind. And while that is actually really important, and I'm going to get to that later, I start even farther back than that. I start at the beginning of the school year by thinking about what I want my students to get out of the class, who I want them to be at the end of the class, and how I want the lessons and the content that I teach them to change them. Usually it has something to do with these words. I want my students to know how to advocate for themselves. And so everything I teach them is really coming from an area of experience and interest for me, which is law. I want my students to understand how the world works and how the world will challenge them to justify and defend their positions, their beliefs. What that means is that everything that I teach them has a component that looks like that. It means that each of my units has a core value that's really at the heart of it. Something I want my students to learn, like justice, integrity, and things like that. Those are things that you can also plan for, as long as you're really intentional from the beginning about where you want your students to be at the end. Now, so what does that mean? How do I plan a unit with great instructional design? Well, you start at the beginning by choosing a goal for the class, then a goal for each unit that basically explains how that unit is going to contribute to the overall goal. So you can look at this as stating an essential question, but those essential questions can't always be all about content. The reason is because that will result in it not being very relevant for your students. And so when you design with these things in mind, your students understand where you're coming from and why they need to learn the content that you're trying to teach. And it's not just for a test. But that takes us to the other part of this. Once I've decided and sort of set a goal for who my students will be, I have to figure out how to get them there. Okay. And what that means is that how am I going to use content to reinforce these ideas where there may be a skill or something that the students are going to learn in order to be able to equip them to be able to perform other higher levels of thinking about these bigger issues and things in society. So that means that I do go to whatever my content standards are. For most of you, that is Common Core, and you understand how the Common Core standards actually fit, how they fit into who you want your students to be. Our Common Core posters are a great resource for this. They actually talk about not just real world, but personal reasons why students should want to learn and why they will learn the Common Core standards inside class. From there, you design your assessment. Your assessment is going to test in a rigorous way and in a real way everything you've taught your students. Teachers oftentimes fall short of assessing their students the way that they will in the end. I don't have a problem with it. There is not a choice between teaching to the test and teaching content. We live in a situation and a reality right now where they are the same thing. And it's okay to do that. You want your students to be prepared. You don't want them to feel like they have been caught off guard when they go in to take a test. So every day, actually, every lesson that I prepare, there's actually an assessment that looks something like your students will have to do. There'll be an open-ended response item, an essay prompt, or there will be a multiple choice question that I actually designed with a released test item right in front of me so that I know I'm actually I'm being genuine in what this is going to look like in the test. And so at the end of the lesson, it's an afterthought and an exit ticket for me. And it's not a big deal. And because I've been teaching little aspects of the test the whole year, my students are not freaked out at the end of the year when they have to finally get the opportunity to show what they know. So with our overall goals and who we want our students to become, right? What lessons they're going to learn about being a person and being a citizen and being successful, along with the content that basically explains and shows what that success has to look like, what they have to be able to do. So these are my content standards. What I do from then is I actually design a unit that tells a story. Many teachers, when I go into their classrooms, their lessons bounce around. This week, I might be talking about this thing. This week, I'll be talking about something else. One of the units that'll be released very soon is the Nixon Legacies unit. That unit comes right after the Martin Luther King unit. That's a really, really great continuous story. So instead of just allowing Martin Luther King's story to end with his death and assassination in 1968, what this allows us to do is to continue to understand the legacy that Martin Luther King left while actually examining Nixon's legacy as well as president. So what that means is that I pay attention to the storyline, whether I teach English or whether I'm teaching history or even biology for that matter. I pay attention to how all of these things are connected. We talked a little bit about this in the literature session. We talked about leaving breadcrumbs for your students to follow. We know that learning is so much about making connections. It's about those neurons and those synapses firing. And a smart student is really just a student with the ability to make those connections. And so what really intelligent students are able to do is to make connections to information. Think of it like having a lot of access points to one thing. So when our students are able to think clearly, when they're able to write and come up with ideas, it's because they can see the connection between those ideas. But this doesn't always happen naturally for our students. We have to leave connections for the students to follow. We have to force them to examine the way in which one thing sort of counteracts another. And the only way we can do that is with intentional planning. So think of it like a storyline or a plot diagram. What is going to be the exposition of your stories? What can you teach that's going to introduce them to the basic concepts, situations, and characters that they're going to be learning about? From there, you're going to introduce a conflict. You're going to show where this person's life took a turn, or this character's life took a turn. And then finally, you're going to go to the climax and then sort of how it ends, but also understand that the story continues. So that when you're done with one short story or one lesson, you sort of make a connection and sort of lead it into the next thing. And then you compare the two. And then you add another story and you compare all three. So that it's important for students to understand that nothing you teach them ever goes away. But that's a difficult thing to do when we teach one standard at a time and we teach them in isolation. And then we really do jump from one story to another. Intentional design is great instructional design. It means that we don't allow things to happen by chance. Yes, there will be some questions and things that come up without that you hadn't planned for. But those are your teachable moments and you should take them when they come. But most of what you need to happen for your students to make those connections, for your students to get the most out of every lesson and every unit and every school year, you have to practice really, really great instructional design. You can look at that instructional design as intelligent design. Like a lot of people, there's an argument about that, right? How do we get to be the great intelligent species that we are? Most people don't think that happened randomly. Well, I can tell you for sure in a classroom, great units, great lessons, great classes, and great students don't happen randomly either. It takes a lot of work. But, and this is the final thing that's probably going to be followed up in a different session, that work can be split up in two ways. You can take advantage of the wealth of resources out there. I know Teachers Pay Teachers has a really, really great one, and a lot of teachers will Google things as well. I like to design my units where they have all of these things in mind so that a 4-week unit is really a story with all of the components connected to each other. But those are things that you can also do. It helps to use the resources that are available to you, but understand that these resources who are developed by different people aren't generally going to have a path that is connected. They're not going to have commonalities and a thread that you can pull through unless you really, really work to do that. What I can offer you is the impact that this kind of instructional design will make on your students. Your students will think more deeply about the information that you introduce, because instead of your students lacking background information and prior knowledge, which a lot of our students do, you're building prior knowledge with every unit that you add. You're giving them a frame of reference and other information that they can attach this to, which forms a stronger connection and an easier pathway inside their brains. In doing this, let's say, I'll give you another analogy, another example. If you're like me, it's very easy for your computer desktop to become like a mess of files that are randomly distributed around the desktop itself, okay, with no order or no organization. And when things like that happen, if there wasn't a such thing as a search engine, a search feature of the computer, I would probably lose a lot of different stuff. But that brings up two important pieces of information. Now that I own a company and I have to be more organized because I am working with other people, then what I find is two things. Well, one thing, and this is something our students do as well, is that they don't associate information with the proper keywords. Right? So that if I'm looking for a document that I've lost in all the clutter and I haven't been very intentional about how I was going to name it, what I was going to frame it as, then I have difficulty finding it. And then finally, I understand that if I create folders that groups information, it's a lot easier for me to see the patterns in that information and understand where things are most likely to go. So even then, it's easier for me to retrieve information. Now, all of this happens with instructional design, and I know I've been speaking about the brain like it's a computer, and that's because it is. It's the most advanced computer on earth, and if we don't teach our students how to use it, well, we'll lose it. And that's not a battle that we want to lose. So what do we want our students to do? We want them to follow our lead. We want to be prepared, we want to be organized, and we want to have a systematic way of teaching everything. If there's a quality your students are lacking, you can also help yourself with classroom management, not just because you're prepared and you're organized so that you can transition very quickly from one thing to another, but also because you're teaching them to be the type of people you want to teach and the type of people who will teach others those sort of core values and things. So with that being said, if you are very intentional about your instructional design, you will have a really, really great group of students, and they'll follow your lead and your passion, and they'll understand how this is going to help them. I wanted to leave a resource. This actually is a resource that's available. It's a planning template for really, really great instructional design. You can look at it. It's sort of intensive for most people, but the advantage to it is that you are always improving upon your instruction. It actually guides you through the process of, I use a strategy called earmarking. And so EAR stands for engagement, alignment, and rigor. And so even the planning template actually starts with alignment, because this is where you're going to actually set the goal for the content and information that you want your students to know. The next part is the engagement. This is where you're going to build background and connect your students' learning to something that's interesting to them. Usually it's a lot of writing. And you'll see that in the units that I produce, because they're meant to connect the students' personal experiences and their lifelong goals to the content that we want them to learn. And then after the engagement, which is the piece about bringing them in, there is the rigor, which is really the deep questioning that I'm going to actually focus on my students. But along the side of this planning template, there's actually a parallel structure for teachers, where the teachers actually give themselves feedback. And this is also a great mechanism for administrators to give feedback to their teachers as well about specific details in their text. There's also a place for teachers to keep their own feedback and write notes about instruction. If you're like most of the teachers I know, your third period class does not get the same instruction that your first period class gets. And that's because you learn stuff along the way. So if you leave these notes, then you'll know how to go back and edit things throughout the summer to really shore up these lessons and even improve if you're designing your own lessons. And so we've talked about the advantages that your students will get from this type of instruction. And the real advantage, and what will probably interest you most, is that with these changes to your instructional practices, you can do what we always say in closing: have fun teaching.